Picture Emily Thompson standing alone as a military colonel approaches her with an offer she can't refuse. Just yesterday, she was a waitress fired for kindness. Now, her life's about to change. What did she do to deserve this? Watch to discover how one brave choice turns into a life-altering reward. If this hooks you, subscribe for more inspiring stories. Emily Thompson stood behind the counter of Joe's diner, wiping the same spot for what felt like the 100th time that night. The clock ticked toward closing, its hands dragging through the quiet hours. The diner, a modest roadside stop with chipped paint and flickering neon, had been nearly empty all evening, a bad sign for tips. Emily's apron pocket held a measly few dollars, nowhere near enough to cover the rent looming just days away. She sighed, her breath catching the faint scent of coffee and grease that clung to everything. The bell above the door chimed, sharp and sudden in the stillness. Emily looked up to see two figures hesitating at the threshold, a man and a boy. The man, tall and lean, wore faded clothes that hung loosely on his frame. His boots were caked with dust, his face etched with lines that spoke of hard years. Beside him, clutching his hand, was a boy, no more than 8, his eyes bright but shadowed with a quiet weariness. They stepped inside, the man's movements slow, deliberate, as if every step cost him something. He approached the counter, fishing a handful of crumpled bills from his pocket. His voice, low and gravelly, carried a hint of reluctance. "What can I get for $5? Emily glanced at the menu board behind her. A burger alone was $8. Fries would push it higher. $5 wouldn't stretch far, not even close. She studied the man's face, the way his jaw tightened as he smoothed the bills, and then the boy, whose hopeful gaze darted between his father and the counter. Something twisted in her chest. "For $5? She said, forcing a smile. "You're in luck. We've got a special tonight. A kid's meal. Just your price." The man's brow furrowed, suspicion flickering in his tired eyes. "A special?" "Yep," Emily replied, already scribbling the order. "Comes with a burger, fries, and a drink. Perfect for him." She nodded toward the boy, who grinned shyly. The man hesitated, then nodded. "All right, thank you, miss." Minutes later, Emily slid a tray in front of the boy. Tommy, she'd heard the man call him. The kid's face lit up as he tore into the burger, ketchup smearing his fingers. But the man, David, she'd caught from their quiet exchange, sat still, his hands folded on the counter. No plate, no food, just watching his son with a faint, bittersweet smile. "Aren't you eating?" Emily asked, keeping her tone light. David shook his head. "Not hungry, he needs it more." The lie was plain as day. She saw it in the hollows of his cheeks, the way his eyes lingered on the food. Without a word, she turned back to the kitchen, her hands moving before her mind could catch up. She plated a burger, piled on fries, and carried it back to the counter. "Here," she said, setting it in front of him. "On the house." David's head snapped up, surprise flashing across his face. "I can't pay for this." "You don't have to," Emily said softly. "You look like you've had a long day. Eat." For a moment, he just stared at her, something unreadable passing through his expression. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. Then, slowly, he picked up the burger, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," he murmured, voice thick. Before he could take a bite, a harsh voice sliced through the diner. "Emily!" She turned to see Rick Johnson, the manager, storming from the back. His apron was stained, his scowl deeper than usual. "What the hell are you doing?" Emily squared her shoulders. "I covered it. It's my money." Rick snorted, crossing his arms. "This isn't a soup kitchen. You don't get to play hero with my inventory." "They're not charity cases," she shot back. "He's a veteran. That's his son. So what?" Rick's lip curled. "Not my problem." Then, in a move that made Emily's stomach drop, he snatched the plate from David and dumped it into the trash. The clatter echoed in the silent diner. Tommy froze mid-bite, his eyes wide. David's hands stilled, but his face remained eerily calm. "You didn't have to do that," David said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension. Rick dusted his hands off. "And you don't get to eat for free." Emily's fists clenched. "You're disgusting." Rick smirked. "And you're fired. Get your stuff and go." The words hit like a punch, But Emily didn't flinch. She scanned the room, waitresses avoiding her gaze, a few late-night customers whispering, but no one spoke up. She untied her apron, tossing it onto the counter. David stood, his voice cutting through the haze. "Miss, you didn't deserve that." "Neither did you," she replied, meeting his eyes. "I'm sorry." "You've got nothing to apologize for," he said, then took Tommy's hand and headed for the door. Emily grabbed her coat and stepped into the night, the cold biting at her skin. She'd lost her job, her only lifeline, for a single act of kindness. As she walked away, Rick's mocking laughter echoed behind her. But something told her this wasn't the end, not yet. Emily trudged through the quiet streets of her small town, the cold night air stinging her face as she made her way home. Her apron was still stuffed in her bag, the faint smell of grease clinging to her clothes, a bitter reminder of the job she'd just lost. The scene at Joe's diner replayed in her mind. Rick's harsh words, the clatter of David's plate hitting the trash, and the helpless look in little Tommy's eyes. She'd only wanted to help them, to offer a moment of kindness in a world that seemed to have forgotten how. And for that, she'd been fired. Her chest burned with a mix of anger and injustice, but beneath it, a quieter fear gnawed at her. Rent was due in a week, and her meager savings wouldn't cover it. She'd been scraping by as it was. Waitressing at the diner wasn't glamorous, but it had kept a roof over her head. Now, that was gone. She had no plan, no fallback, just a one-room apartment waiting for her at the end of this walk, its walls closing in tighter with every step. When she reached her building, she fumbled with her keys, her hands shaky from more than just the chill. Inside, the space felt suffocating. A single bed, a tiny kitchenette, and a stack of bills on the table stared back at her. She sank onto the mattress, burying her face in her hands. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Her mind churned with questions. What now? How do I fix this? And every time she closed her eyes, she saw Rick's sneer. Morning brought no answers, but Emily couldn't afford to stay still. She pulled on her coat and headed out, determined to find something, anything, to keep her afloat. The town wasn't big, but there had to be work somewhere. She spent hours weaving through familiar streets, stopping at the grocery store, the gas station, even the hardware shop. Each time, she forced a smile, handed over an application, and asked if they were hiring. Each time, the answer was the same. Not right now. By noon, her feet ached and her hope was fraying. She found herself near Joe's diner again, almost by accident. She didn't mean to stop, but her legs slowed as she passed, her eyes lingering on the faded sign. That's when she heard it, a low, rumbling sound that rolled through the air like distant thunder. She turned, frowning, as a line of military vehicles appeared at the end of the street. Jeeps and armored trucks, their engines growling, moved in a slow convoy toward the diner. Heads poked out of shops, curiosity rippling through the town. Emily's stomach twisted. What was this? Inside Joe's, Rick wiped down the counter with his usual gruff efficiency, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. He'd already put Emily out of his mind. She'd been a thorn in his side, too soft for the real world. The bell above the door jingled, and he looked up, expecting another regular. Instead, a tall man in a crisp military uniform stepped inside, followed by a dozen soldiers in perfect formation. The diner went silent, forks hovering mid-air, conversations dying in an instant. Rick straightened, his smirk faltering. "Can I help you?" The officer's gaze swept the room, sharp and unyielding. "We're looking for Emily Thompson." Rick blinked, caught off guard. "She doesn't work here anymore." "We're aware," the officer said coolly. Before Rick could stammer a reply, the door opened again and David stepped in. But this wasn't the weary man in worn clothes from the night before. Today, he wore a military dress uniform, medals glinting on his chest, his posture radiating quiet strength. Tommy wasn't with him, but his presence alone shifted the air in the room. Rick's jaw tightened. "What's this about?" David ignored him, addressing the officer instead. "This is Colonel James Carter," he said, his voice steady. "And these men are my brothers." Rick shifted uncomfortably. I don't get it. David's eyes met his, unflinching. Last night, Emily showed me and my son kindness when no one else did. You punished her for it. Colonel Carter stepped forward, his authority filling the space. David Mitchell is a decorated veteran, a hero. He's saved more lives than you can count. And what happened here yesterday is a disgrace. Rick's hands clenched at his sides, his voice unsteady. I didn't know who he was. You didn't care? David cut in, his tone like steel. That's the problem. The room held its breath, tension crackling in the silence. Then Colonel Carter turned toward the window, his eyes finding Emily where she stood outside, rooted to the spot. Emily Thompson, he called, his voice carrying through the glass. Every gaze swung to her. Her heart pounded, urging her to run, but the colonel's steady look drew her forward. She stepped inside, the diner's warmth doing nothing to calm her nerves. Rick stared, his face pale. What is this? Colonel Carter focused on Emily, ignoring Rick entirely. We heard what happened last night. How you stood up for David and his son. That kind of integrity is rare. Emily glanced at David, who gave her a small nod. I just couldn't let them go hungry, she said softly. The colonel's expression softened slightly. We run a program for veterans and their families, helping them find jobs, support, a fresh start. We need someone with heart, someone who cares. We'd like you to join us. Emily's breath caught. Me? A job? Not in uniform, he said with a faint smile. You'd be working with people like David and Tommy, making a difference in their lives. Her mind reeled. Yesterday, she'd lost everything. Now this? Rick snorted, his voice dripping with disbelief. You're kidding, she's a waitress. Colonel Carter's gaze turned cold. And she's already done more for this community than you ever will. The words hung heavy in the air. Emily looked down at the business card the colonel handed her, her hands trembling. David stepped closer, his voice low. You don't have to decide now. But you're worth more than this place ever saw. She nodded, her throat tight. Thank you. With that, the colonel and his men filed out, their boots echoing in the stillness. David lingered a moment longer, his eyes meeting hers. Take care, he said, then followed them. The door swung shut, leaving the diner stunned. Rick exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. What a circus. Emily turned to him, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. You should be ashamed, he sneered. You think this changes anything? They'll forget you by tomorrow. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked out, clutching the card like a lifeline. The air outside was crisp, the convoy rumbling away down the street. For the first time in hours, she felt something flicker inside her. Hope. Emily stood outside the diner, the business card still clutched in her hand as the last echoes of the military convoy faded into the distance. Her mind spun with the weight of what had just happened. Less than a day ago, she'd been fired for helping a father and his son, two strangers who had walked into her life with nothing but a few crumpled bills and a quiet plea for food. Now, those same strangers had returned, not just to thank her, but to offer her a chance at something bigger, something meaningful. She looked down at the card, Veterans Transition Center. The name felt solid, real, like a promise of change. Her life had been a series of dead-end jobs and disappointments, each one chipping away at her belief that things could get better. Yet, standing here, with the crisp air filling her lungs and the memory of David's steady gaze, she felt a spark of hope she hadn't allowed herself in years. The next morning, Emily woke early, her stomach knotted with nerves. She dressed carefully, pulling on her best blouse and smoothing her hair. The address on the card led her to a large brick building on the outskirts of town, a place she'd passed countless times without noticing. Now, as she approached, she saw the parking lot filled with cars and a few military vehicles, their presence lending an air of quiet authority. Inside, the lobby was bright and welcoming, with sunlight streaming through tall windows. A receptionist greeted her with a warm smile. You must be Emily Thompson. Yes, Emily replied, her voice catching slightly. They're waiting for you, the woman said, gesturing down a hallway. Go on in. Emily took a deep breath and walked forward, her footsteps echoing softly. At the end of the hall, Colonel James Carter stood from behind a large desk as she entered. He offered a firm handshake, his grip steady and reassuring. Glad you came, he said, motioning for her to sit. Emily settled into the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm here. Carter leaned back, studying her with a thoughtful expression. You've already shown us what kind of person you are, Emily. That's why we want you on our team. She glanced around the office, taking in the framed photographs of soldiers, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, all smiling. Medals and commendations lined the walls, but what caught her eye was a simple sign on the desk. No one left behind. The words struck a chord deep within her. What exactly would I be doing? She asked, her voice steadier now. Carter leaned forward, his tone earnest. Our program helps veterans and their families transition back to civilian life. Some need jobs, others need housing, and many just need someone to remind them they're not alone. We work with local businesses, government agencies, and volunteers to make sure no one slips through the cracks. Your role would be to help with outreach, assist in job placement, and, most importantly, be a compassionate presence for these men and women. Emily's heart quickened. I don't have any experience in this kind of work. You have the most important qualification, Carter said. You care, and that's something we can't teach. She thought of David and Tommy, of the way David's shoulders had slumped under the weight of his struggles, and how Tommy's eyes had lit up at the sight of a simple meal. She'd seen firsthand how much a small act of kindness could mean. And David? She asked. Is he part of this too? Carter smiled. He's already signed on. Turns out he's got a lot to offer. He just needed a reminder of his own strength. Emily nodded, a warmth spreading through her chest. The idea of working alongside David, of helping others like him, felt right in a way she couldn't quite explain. I'll do it, she said, the words coming easier than she'd expected. Carter's smile widened. Welcome to the team, Emily. Over the next few months, Emily threw herself into her new role with a passion she hadn't known she possessed. The work was challenging, navigating paperwork, coordinating with businesses, and most of all, listening to the stories of the veterans who came through the center's doors. Each one carried their own burdens, their own battles. But Emily learned that sometimes, the smallest gestures, a warm meal, a kind word, a moment of understanding, could make all the difference. One afternoon, as she was organizing a job fair for the veterans, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she found David standing there, looking sharper than she'd ever seen him. He wore a polo shirt with the center's logo, his hair neatly trimmed and his posture strong. But it was the light in his eyes that struck her most, a quiet confidence that had been missing when they'd first met. Hey, he said, his voice warm. Hey yourself, Emily replied, smiling. How's it going? David glanced around the bustling room. It's strange, he admitted. For so long I thought my life was over, that no one cared. Then you came along and everything changed. Emily's throat tightened. I just did what anyone should have done. Maybe, David said, his gaze steady. But you were the only one who did. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply squeezed his hand. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the veterans move through the fair, some laughing, others deep in conversation. That evening, as Emily locked up the office, she stepped outside and looked up at the sky, now streaked with the colors of sunset. The town, once just a place to survive, now felt like home. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick message to Colonel Carter. Thank you for believing in me. His reply came almost instantly. We don't leave good people behind. Emily smiled, slipping her phone back into her pocket. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged, not just to a place, but to a purpose. 6 months later, the center hosted its first community event, an open house connecting veterans with employers, support groups, and resources. Emily had poured her heart into organizing it, and as she watched the room fill with people, her chest swelled with pride. Veterans of all ages mingled, some hesitant, others hopeful, but all of them taking a step toward something better. She spotted David across the room, laughing with a group of younger veterans, his son Tommy at his side, grinning ear to ear. Colonel Carter was deep in conversation with a local business owner, likely securing more job opportunities. And then, at the entrance, she saw a man standing uncertainly, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his eyes scanning the room with doubt. Emily walked over, offering a warm smile. First time here? The man nodded, his voice gruff. Yeah, wasn't sure if this was for me. It is, she said gently. Everyone here felt the same way at first, but I promise you'll be glad you came. He hesitated, then stepped inside, and Emily watched as a volunteer greeted him, guiding him toward a booth. A quiet satisfaction filled her. This was why she was here. Later, as the event wound down, David found her outside, the cool evening air wrapping around them. You did good, Emily, he said, his voice soft. She shook her head. We did good. David smiled, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded napkin. He handed it to her without a word. Emily unfolded it, her breath catching. It was the receipt from the meal she'd bought for Tommy that night at the diner, the one that had started everything. I kept it, David said, his voice thick with emotion, as a reminder that even when I thought no one cared, someone did. Emily's eyes welled with tears. David! He clapped her on the shoulder, his touch gentle. You changed my life, Emily, and now you're changing so many others. She wiped her eyes, the napkin clutched in her hand. That one small act of kindness had set off a chain reaction, touching lives she'd never imagined. And as she stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she knew this was only the beginning.